All right. Well, I think we're ready to begin here. Well, hello, everybody. Hope that we're going to get some people start joining us here in a moment.
Yeah, it's you and me. That's all right. That's okay.
Maybe next time I'll get it started for everybody so they can join us a little faster there and help us get started. Looking to make sure that we are actually online here, and I see we are on, and we'll wait till some people join us.
Okay. Okay, Stuart.
It's always good to talk about God's word and how to live it out.
Okay, you still there?
Yes.
Okay. As the host, go ahead whenever the questions start coming.
Yep.
Big crowd.
Well,
Yeah, I'm good.
so someone's joined us. Who's joined us? Give us a shout out in the chat. Tell us who you are as you join in. I see that we've got a couple people joining us now, so we thank you for that. If you got questions, about different things in the Bible or faith, theology, apologetics, type those in the chat for us, and we'll do our best to try to answer those questions. Anybody? Or at the very least, those of you who are watching, and Dave and I will have a great talk through talking about Jesus, and then we can answer questions as people join us. So why don't we get started with that? So thanks so much for being here with us online for our question and answer time period in our live stream. And so I'm Pastor Stuart Ross, discipleship team leader at CLC, overseeing all kind of discipleship and adult ministries at the church. And with me is my good friend, Dave Nedostup. Say hello, hi. Say hello, Dave.
Hi. I mean, Dave.
Dave is one of our leading apologetics teachers, one of our leading Bible teachers at the church, and has co-taught several classes with me and with other members of our CLC apologetics team. And so we're really excited to Dave and I really enjoy doing this, and throw some questions at us as time goes on here tonight. And we'll try to answer your questions and see where we go with that.
Okay, Stuart, you know what?
Yes.
I was teaching at Wright State University for about 7 years. And right now I'm looking for a person who might want to be a director on the campus.
Okay, talk about that for a minute. What does that involve?
Right now, about a year or so ago, I kind of retired from that. But the ministry is called Oratio Christi, which is Latin for Reason of Christ. It's an international organization, kind of more of a movement than an organization, that is designed to help the students at the universities and the faculty to tackle these difficult questions that come up in the real world that young students have. So I'm looking, if any of you are interested in that, let me know.
So does someone have to have experience doing that to kind of help lead that group?
Actually, just more of an interest or a passion to love people and to learn and to grow systematically in a desire in evangelism, but primarily on the intellectual side of the historic Christian faith and answering the big questions that people have.
And so if someone were maybe interested in that, wasn't sure what that's about, what kind of impact would you, what kind of a schedule would that look like when you ran that? How often did you do something, every month or every week or so forth?
Well, for once or twice a week, we had sessions on campus, and they gave us a classroom at Wright State
Okay.
University. I did this again for 7 years. And basically what I would do is also bring in guest speakers, apologists. We had
Mhm.
um, Frank Turek came in, who wrote "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist."
Yep.
We had Paul Nelson with the what's the movement in evolution, dealing with the problem of evolution.
Yeah. Yeah. Answers in Genesis.
Yes, no, not Answers in Genesis. It's the other one, the big one. Can't think of the name of it. Anyway, so what we
Okay.
would do is we would have sessions, and students would come in, and they would bring, sometimes they brought their professors into the classroom, and they
Oh,
would
wow.
want to challenge me because they didn't know how. Some of the philosophy professors or some of the other students that were of all different persuasions, philosophically and in religion. And I really was bounced around quite a bit there. So that's what we want you to do right now. Ask us some really tough questions. But you would love this. If you're interested in really doing evangelism in the 21st century, this would be something that you really need to think about pursuing.
Okay. That's great. Well, again, if you're interested in being involved with this Christian ministry on Wright State University, you can contact Dave. Uh, if you are interested, I'd say probably drop me an email at sross@clcdayton.org, and I'll get your name to Dave so he can contact you and you guys can talk about all that. So
Okay.
we'll get started here. As you join, if you can give us some questions, we've got a few that some people have sent in beforehand that we can talk about. But we thought we'd start off by giving you a little taste of a presentation that Dave and I we were putting together, and we were hoping to be able to present on a Wednesday night after Greg Kuchel, who's a leading apologist with Stand to Reason Ministries, was going to join us a couple weeks ago, but of course with the pandemic, everything got canceled. So we'll present this entire presentation at some point in the future, I hope. But we want to give you a taste of it tonight and see if that raises some questions, but at least equip you if you're interested as a believer in thinking about these things. And if you're not, this might raise some questions that you might have, and we can kind of start the conversation discussion from there. So really, I'm going to kind of show you we had a presentation, so I'll show you some slides from that. And then Dave and I will kind of talk through some of what you're going to be seeing here. And the name of our presentation was Taking Jesus Seriously, Is He God of Man? Who actually was Jesus? And so we'll kind of really, the question we're asking ourselves, who was Jesus? And part of that comes down to, and we could talk another time about, is he as a historical figure, the evidence for that, and maybe that'll come up. But really, the question that we often we're looking at is this issue of if Jesus, what was there about him that was so controversial, that was so brought such attention, positive and negative? It really comes down to this question of what does it mean to be God, and who did Jesus think he was in connection to that whole idea and concept. And so I've asked Dave if he'll kind of talk to us a little bit about what does it mean to be God.
Well, thank you, Stuart. I will get right into this. The whole issue of Jesus being God is something that is constantly attacked in the world of the world religions and cults. And so it's very important that we as Christians know how to defend the deity of Christ. The deity means that he's God, because this is one of the essentials of the faith that is constantly being badgered and bandied around. Well, according to the Jewish conception of God, was absolutely unique. Next slide. There's only one. Okay, Deuteronomy 6:4. It's called the Tetragrammaton. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And so under the Jewish mind, they understood a strong monotheism, that there is only one God, and that the concept of the Trinity was not known back then. It was alluded to in the Old Testament, but when the word us, let us make man in our image, the concept of us is Elohim. And Elohim is the plural, one of the plurals in the Hebrew for who God is. So he alone is perfect, all powerful, knowing, he's omniscient, uncreated. Some of the heresies in the first century, they dealt with this whole issue of Jesus was it's called Arianism, back in the 3rd century. But he's uncreated. He's without beginning or end. He's the ruler of all things. He alone created and sustains the universe. And he's without limits. He has no competition. Okay, God taking the form of a man, this is the key here, folks. This is the incarnation. This is where we understand that the God of the universe took on a body. And the whole thing there is called the hypostatic union. That means that he is 100% God and 100% man. This is classic Orthodox Christian theology. And it's very, very important that we get a good solid handle on this doctrine. Taking the form of a man in Philippians chapter 2, known as the kenosis passage, the word form in the Greek is morphe. And so when Jesus took on the form of a man, he was adding to his deity, adding into his humanity deity. And so he had two natures. He was one person with two natures, God and man. Next one. Next slide. By claiming to be the God of the universe, Jesus was creating an identity crisis. This is important because in the Jewish mindset, you didn't claim to be God or you were blaspheming. And so the identity crisis here had to do with his deity and his humanity in one. He's one person with two natures. Next slide. Was he crazy or was he joking or was he lying? Was he Lord, liar, or lunatic? This was one of the favorites of Josh McDowell, C.S. Lewis, back in the 1970s when the dinosaurs were on the earth. And anyway, okay, next slide. When they say Jesus was a good man, here we go. This is good. And a prophet. Just a second. I am getting some stuff on my, okay. But he wasn't God or the only savior. You can ask, how could Jesus be a good man and a prophet, but be mistaken about his own identity and purpose? That's kind of crazy. If Jesus was wrong about his frequent claim that he was God, the unique means for salvation, or if he was lying or deeply deceived, it then becomes difficult to call him a good man, a prophet, or a wise religious teacher. Go ahead. Who was he? Jesus was misunderstood. Okay, these are some of the arguments that are against him being God or his deity. Go ahead. But the historical evidence says otherwise. Jesus's self-understanding cannot be reduced a charismatic leader or just a Jewish teacher, because he couldn't be either one of those if he claimed to be God and he was crazy, right? So let's move on. Okay. Before Abraham was, I am. Now this is interesting because in John 8:58, it says in Greek, Prin Abraham genesthai ego ami. And the ego ami in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, in Exodus 3:14, God is talking to Moses at the burning bush. And there, Moses said, who shall I say sends me to the Israelites? And the Hebrew word is achia. There's achia, aksher, achia, which in the Hebrew is that I am who I am. Go ahead. Very truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. There, that's ego ami. versus achia in the Old Testament. To the Jews, his claim to be God was unmistakable. All right, number one, I have here, he never really claimed to be God. This explanation fails. So let's find out why it fails.
Well, as we just looked at, Dave, I think actually you answered that. That was sort of the conclusion slide.
Okay.
The idea was that the Jewish leaders knew he was claiming to be God when he made that statement that you read in John 8:58. Before Abraham was born, I am. And so, as we saw, I think that the Jewish leaders tried to kill Jesus because he was calling God his own father and making himself equal with God. And
Yeah.
so, I think that really does kind of bring together. There's no way you can say that Jesus didn't never claim to be God.
That's right.
So another one, if still waiting for some questions to come in here, if we want to continue, I think the next one I'd like to talk about was if Jesus, if one of the misunderstandings was he never claimed to be God, that's not true. What about this idea, well, Jesus was just a legend? Maybe there was a person, with that name or some great teacher, but he was never the Jesus that we see in the Bible. The Jesus of the Bible is just a legend. And so that might be an idea that maybe you've heard in some form or another. And the idea essentially is that his followers later invented the idea. So if you look at this timeline here, this chart that's on the screen, you can see that you've got Jesus there in the far left, born around 4 BC actually, and lived his life 33 years. But then there were those who were around his followers, in his disciples, those who followed him in his ministry, and then those who after his death claimed his resurrection. And so he was seen by up to 500 people, the Apostle Paul tells us. But the idea is people would say nowadays, this concept that, well, those people thought he was great, but they never claimed that he was God. And it was later on, kind of after that dividing line that you see there around 200 AD, that people started then saying Jesus is God. That's sort of the idea. Well, if that were really the case, then we really would have to know, be able to ask this question and answer it. Did eyewitnesses who saw Jesus and knew him and saw him during his time when he was alive, did they think that he was God? So what about those first followers? We see in Acts that they were called Christians. Then that's where that term really came. It was in Antioch of Syria. See that in Acts. So these first Christians, did they think that Jesus was God? And so if we look at this, here's a number of early Christians from the 1st and 2nd century who would be within very close time frame, would be eyewitnesses or know people who were eyewitnesses. And what did they say about him? And so some quotes would be, Jesus, who is our God, who is both God and man, not a mere man, but who was God. So as we think about this whole idea, we could find many quotes and sayings and teachings where these individuals who were eyewitnesses or close or knew eyewitnesses would say that he was. And so these people who walked with Jesus agreed about his divine nature. They agreed about the threefold nature of God, how to explain that there's a God who's been made flesh. And that's where the Christians understand the Father is God, Jesus the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. And later on, people began to call this the Trinity. But that doesn't mean that that idea has not always been. We can see traces of the Trinity even going back to the Old Testament. And if that's, sometimes that brings up some questions from people. That's something perhaps we could address in the future. And so this whole idea of the Bible, who's it? Is it a book written by people? Well, yes, but inspired by the Holy Spirit, the Bible claims. And so if we think about this idea, did the early Christians see Jesus as God? I wanted to share this quote with you. I thought was really helpful. Jesus' influence, his teachings, his claims, his miracles, his fulfillment of prophecy, his death, and his resurrection all combined to convince the first disciples that their master is no mere man, but Lord and God. They've heard the authority of his teaching, they've seen the authority of his miracles, and then supremely of his death and resurrection. And so, of course, they put his teaching on at least a level with the Old Testament. And so as we look into the historical writings of the Bible, we see the Gospels show that Jesus' followers gradually came to that conviction. It's not something they thought right away, but as he showed more and more of who he was, they we get to the point where after his resurrection, when he appears to disciples and Thomas, who had not seen him in his first appearance, sees him, he says to the risen Christ, "My Lord and my God." Imagine, here's a Jewish man talking about another man and saying, this man is God. That's not something a Jew would say unless they were convinced of the divine nature of who Jesus was. And so essentially the New Testament showing us that, yes, God had spoken the Old Testament scriptures, but that Jesus, the Word, that's what John chapter 1, that's what John's trying to say there, that the Word, the final revelation of God is Jesus Christ. And so if we look at the letters of the New Testament, many that were written even before the Gospels, they show how the belief in Jesus was part of, it was this foundation of belief that created the Christian faith. Writing in the early 60s, someone who was an eyewitness of the times of Jesus, the Apostle Paul writes in Colossians that Jesus is the image of the God we cannot see, the one by whom all things were made and all things were created for him. And he declares that he's the head of the Christian body of the church. In him, all things hold together. And so we can see that even in the early church, they clearly saw that Jesus, they worshiped him as God, that he was the source of the universe, the sustainer, and the goal of the universe. It all summarizes in him. And Paul says about Jesus in Colossians 2, in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. And so it's this whole idea that Jesus was just a legend and he never claimed to be God in that sense, that was sort of a fabrication of hundreds of years later. That doesn't pass the historical test. We have writings written for the first century by eyewitnesses who claim otherwise, who claim that Jesus was God, and that was proven by his death and his resurrection. And so we can see that Christianity really starts, it wouldn't have started with just an idea. It started with the reality that Jesus had this impact on his followers through his miracles and his death and resurrection. And so they wrote down what he said and what he did in stories. They would have told oral stories to each other first, but then later those would have been written down. And we see those in the Gospels, the four Gospels that we have: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they're very consistent, reliable evidence from early church history of that these four Gospels were written by those four people and connected to them. And you think about it, if they're written in the first century, if they just took someone else's name and put it on some writing, then other people would know that was false. They would know that was saying wasn't true. And so that argues for the historicity of what we're talking about here. Here's a quote from Irenaeus of Lyon from probably the mid second century. So he probably would have been a disciple of one of the first apostles. And he writes that Matthew composed his gospel among the Hebrews in their language, while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and built up the church there. After their deaths, Mark, Peter's follower and interpreter, handed down to us Peter's proclamation in written form. So the Gospel of Mark is really from Peter's recollections in his preaching. Luke, the companion of Paul, wrote in a book the gospel proclaimed by Paul. So Luke was a traveling missionary along with Paul. And so what he writes down includes, it's connected to the other two Gospels of Matthew and Mark that were probably written first, but includes things that Paul was preaching and sharing about who Jesus was as he served as a missionary and spread the gospel in new areas. And then Irenaeus says, finally, John, the Lord's own follower, the one who leaned against his chest, so was very close to Jesus, composed his gospel while living in Ephesus in the province of Asia. And so as we think about that, just to kind of bring that together, you see even in Luke's gospel, how people say, well, how reliable is the Bible? It might have been written years later. Well, Luke tells us that he writes down, he's talking about eyewitnesses. He's talked to them. And he talks about, he's writing down things that have been handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. They saw this. So he's got their eyewitness testimony. He's consulted written accounts, perhaps including Matthew and Mark. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. And then thirdly, he's now writing his gospel. I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. It seemed good also to me to write an orderly account. He's writing to someone, probably a Roman official, by the name of Theophilus, And he writes so he may know the certainty of the things he's been taught. So if we think about the historical nature of these gospels, there are careful investigation, the details that can be corroborated by other secular sources or by archaeology. These are reliable accounts, and these accounts tell us what. And so we'll kind of close this section right here. And so we're looking at the idea of Jesus accepted worship from the disciples. And we see that clearly in Matthew 14. And when he climbed in the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And so, as we've seen in a Jewish culture, there's only the one God. So to say this is probably something. Dave, I'm getting a note here that Joel's trying to see it and they're not seeing it.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, I think
let me just pause for a second here.
Yeah, it's only you and I think. Is it?
I don't know.
I don't know either. That's what. Oh yeah, you got the YouTube. I don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me double check and make sure that we are in business here. So I go to it and I go to videos and I don't see it. Okay. I just see now someone telling me that they can see it.
Who's that?
My daughter just told me she can see it. Let me go just take a moment here and check by going to YouTube here. And if I do that, well, it seems like we're having a little problem here getting this out. No, I think it's on. I think we're on from what I could see. No, actually, it's not there. Huh, that's interesting. Let me see what I can do here. I'm still here.
You see anybody else?
No.
Oh, okay. Well,
I see it on, but I can't see it through the YouTube channel, so I don't know what's going on. It seemed to be working fine.
Yeah, you and I are fine. I don't know.
Let me go back to Zoom and stop this real quick here.
Yeah, it's about 8 o'clock.
Okay. Oh, Joel says it's there.
Huh.
All right. I don't know exactly what problem we're having there, but
Okay.
we'll we'll go to that and see if we can see what's going on. Let me see what the problem might be here. All right. Well, I think we're gonna have to restart, Dave.
Okay. What do you
So
mean?
we'll restart here.
Leave and come back?
Stay on the Zoom call. I just got to restart the live stream.
Okay.
All right, everybody. If you're there, we're gonna restart.